In the scorched hills of Arroyo Bluff, Dean Fletcher wanted nothing more than peace, a quiet life, a few head of cattle, and silence to forget the badge he once wore. But one morning, near a dry creek bed, that silence broke. He found a boy, barefoot, bruised, and burned, a fresh cattle brand on his shoulder, and not a word spoken since. Dean takes him in, no questions asked. But questions come anyway. A powerful rancher shows up with a smile too slick and a deputy too quick, claiming the boy is his runaway ward. Problem is, the boy flinches like he's seen the devil. What Dean uncovers next will shake the dirt under Arroyo Bluff, from forgotten deeds and forged guardianships to a war no one dared fight. One man, one boy, one chance to set things right. Because justice doesn't always wear a star, and family ain't always blood. If you believe no child should ever be branded like cattle, subscribe now and ride with us. And let us know, would you have stood up? The sky over Arroyo Bluff cracked with heat, not a cloud in sight, just a bleached blue dome stretching over sagebrush and sunburnt dirt. Dean Fletcher guided his mare along the dry creek bed, reins loose in one hand, the other wiping sweat from his brow. It had been a quiet morning, until he saw the buzzards. They circled low, uneasy, not over a carcass but something smaller. Dean dismounted slowly, letting the mare graze. His boots crunched over the gravel as he moved closer. That's when he saw the boy, half hidden beneath a splintered mesquite, limbs curled up like a pup trying to vanish, clothes torn, face bloodied, and on his left shoulder, fresh and raw, a cattle brand, still red, still weeping. "Lord above," Dean whispered. The boy flinched at the sound. Dean crouched low, hands open. "Easy now, I ain't here to hurt you." The boy didn't speak, didn't even look up, just shook like a leaf caught in wind. Dean peeled off his neckerchief, dipped it in his canteen, and gently pressed it to the wound. The boy hissed but didn't pull away. That alone told Dean enough. Whoever did this, the boy feared worse than pain. He scooped him up, light as a bag of oats, and laid him across the saddle. The mare snorted but didn't protest. Dean walked them both home, slow and steady. By the time the sun dipped westward, Dean had bathed the boy, bandaged the worst of it, and spooned some broth into him. The boy didn't speak, but he listened, eyes sharp under tangled hair, watching. "You got a name?" Dean asked, voice soft. "Nothing." "All right," he said, folding a worn blanket over the child. "You can borrow mine till you remember." He stepped outside to fetch more firewood. The wind had turned cooler. Coyotes yipped from the hills. Dean had just bent to lift a log when he heard the hoofbeats. 2 horses, steady, official sounding. He stood up slow as the riders came into view. First came Everett Crail, high in the saddle, clean shirt, gold chain glinting from his vest, the kind of man who'd smile while pushing a knife. Beside him rode Deputy Ward, eyes hidden under a low brim, hand resting on his holster. "Well now," Crail called. "Heard tell you found something today." Dean said nothing. Crail eased forward. "See, I've got a boy went missing yesterday. Quiet one, trouble following instructions. Ward of mine. Judge signed papers 2 months back." Dean crossed his arms. "You got a name for this Ward?" "Doesn't talk," Crail said smoothly. "But I know him when I see him." "You brand all your boys like cattle?" That smile flickered. "Sometimes a mark reminds a child where he belongs." Dean stepped forward, slow. "That boy's hurt, scared. And from what I saw, he ain't yours." Deputy Ward shifted in the saddle, but Crail held up a hand. "I've got documents, guardianship, sheriff'll vouch." "Then bring the sheriff," Dean said, voice low. "Till then, he stays put." Crail studied him. "You always had trouble with boundaries, Dean, even back when you wore the badge." Dean didn't move. "And you always had a habit of thinking law was whatever lined your pocket." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Crail turned his horse. "You've got till sundown tomorrow," he called. "After that, I'll be back, with papers and law." Dean watched them ride off, dust curling behind their heels like smoke. Back inside, the boy hadn't moved. but his eyes were open, and when Dean closed the door, he saw it, a full-body flinch at the sound of Crail's voice outside, as if it had left a mark deeper than the brand. Dean exhaled slowly, sat beside the boy, and poured another bowl of broth. "Looks like we've got a storm coming, partner," he murmured. The boy blinked once. Dean nodded. "But I reckon we'll weather it." And outside, the wind picked up. Morning in Arroyo Bluff came sharp and early, sunlight bouncing off the hardpan like a slap. Dean Fletcher had already split wood, fed the mare, and set a pot of beans on the stove before the boy stirred. He moved like something still sore from memory, not just pain, slow, cautious, unsure where the edges of safety began. Dean crouched beside the cot. "You hungry, son?" The boy blinked, silent as ever. "I'll take that as a maybe." Dean ladled a spoonful of beans into a chipped bowl and slid it across. The boy ate with careful, deliberate bites. No eye contact, no sound. But he wasn't flinching anymore. That was progress. Later that afternoon, Dean headed into town to send a wire to the county seat, asking for clarification on Crail's supposed guardianship. He didn't trust a word the man said, especially with that smug talk about papers and law. The clerk at the telegraph office gave him a curious glance. "You really poking that bear, Dean?" "Not poking," Dean muttered. "Just ain't backing down." By the time he returned, the boy had fallen asleep on the porch, curled next to the dog like he belonged there. A softness stirred in Dean's chest, something he hadn't felt in a long while. Maybe not since his own boy died years ago. That ache was buried deep, but not gone. That night, under a sky scattered with stars and questions, Dean sat at the kitchen table, polishing his old revolver out of habit more than need. The boy sat across from him, tracing the grain of the table with one finger. "You got a name?" Dean asked again, gentle. Nothing. Dean sighed, reached for the map rolled in the drawer. It was old, edges yellowed, creased from years of folding, but it still showed every rise and canyon from Arroyo Bluff to the edge of Laketon County. He spread it across the table. "Maybe you can point. Anywhere look familiar?" The boy stared, still and silent. Dean tapped a dry ridge near Buckhorn Gulch. "That wagon was north of here, near Elkhorn Wash. Anything ring a bell?" A pause. Then, the boy moved. He reached out and tapped a spot, small, faint, almost rubbed out from time, a shallow valley marked near a long-abandoned claim. Dean leaned in. "That's Crow Ridge." The boy whispered, barely audible. "Micah." Dean's breath caught. "You say Micah?" The boy nodded once. "Well, Micah," Dean said, voice low, "that's a good name. You just earned yourself a place at this table." The next morning, Dean saddled his mare and tucked a rifle under his saddle blanket. He told Micah to stay put and gave him a tin whistle, just in case. Riding out to Crow Ridge took the better part of the morning. The trail was half swallowed by weeds and dust, the kind of place only ghosts remembered. But halfway up the slope, tucked under a bluff, Dean found it. A wagon, wrecked, weather-worn. One axle snapped clean. He approached slow, hand on his belt. Inside was nothing but bones of old canvas, a rusted skillet, and beneath the floorboards, something heavy. Dean pried it loose, an oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, a lever-action rifle and a water-stained document. He wiped the dust with his thumb. The rifle was etched with initials. M.J. Dean exhaled through his nose. "Micah Jensen," he murmured. "So you do got a past, boy." He unfolded the paper, an old land deed, barely legible but stamped. It was dated more than a decade back, long before Everett Crail ever claimed a stake around here. Dean rolled it tight and stashed it in his coat. As he mounted up, a hawk shrieked overhead, slicing through the sky like a warning. Back at the cabin, Micah looked up when Dean rode in. For the first time, the boy didn't look away. Dean dismounted, handed him the rifle. "Yours, I reckon, or your father's. Either way, it belongs here." Micah cradled it like it held the last piece of someone he lost. And Dean knew right then He wasn't just helping a boy. He was about to challenge the foundation of every lie Everett Crail ever built. Dean laid the rifle across the table like it was sacred, because to Micah, it was. The boy's eyes stayed locked on the worn initials burned into the stock. MJ. He didn't cry, didn't smile either, but something in his posture loosened, like a rope coming off a raw wrist. "You sure that name was Jensen?" Dean asked, holding up the deed. "John M. Jensen?" Micah nodded, quiet but certain. Dean turned the paper in his hands. The ink had faded around the edges, but the county seal was intact. No scratch-outs, no gaps. It was the kind of thing that would hold up in court if someone was brave enough to stand up with it. He folded the deed and tucked it into a leather folio, then stepped outside to think. The porch creaked under his boots as he scanned the horizon. The Crail Ranch sat across the ridge, fat and gleaming with stolen wealth. Dean could feel the lie stretching from those white fences all the way into town. He needed someone who could read this kind of thing with a practiced eye. That meant Silas. Old Silas Tormer lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin 2 miles past Dry Needle Ridge. Used to be a land surveyor, back before the mining company bought him out. These days he mostly argued with squirrels and drank vinegar wine, but his memory was sharp as ever. Dean found him sharpening a spade beside a dying apple tree. "Well, I'll be," Silas grinned, wiping his hands on his pants. "Dean Fletcher. Last I heard, you were chasing outlaws near Rio Vista." "Chased myself out instead," Dean said with a wry tilt of the head. "I need a set of honest eyes." Silas raised a brow. "That sounds serious." Dean laid the deed across a tree stump. Silas leaned over it, squinting. "John M. Jensen. This one's older than most around here. Look at that seal. Pre-consolidation. Before the land office merged with the bank. This here's legal, all right. Rare, too. You don't see many from before 76. You ever hear of a rancher named Everett Crail?" Silas grunted. "Crail? Sure. Bought up half the county in 5 years. Always said he had fast hands and faster paperwork." He glanced up. "What's this about?" Dean hesitated, then told him. About Micah, the brand, the silence. About finding the deed in the wreckage near Crow Ridge. Silas's mouth pulled tight. "I remember that wagon. Fella came through asking about a grazing claim. Quiet man, good with a level. Said his boy loved birds. Next thing I heard, that ridge was empty." Dean waited. Silas finally nodded. "Crail came to me around then, offering gold for blank deeds. Wanted 'em quick, no witnesses. Said it was for speed. I turned him down. Don't know who didn't." Dean's jaw tightened. "So you think he forged them?" "I think he buried more than paper," Silas muttered. Then he reached inside his jacket, pulled out a tiny brass tin, and flipped it open. Inside were clippings, stamps, and pages. "I kept records, unofficial, sure, but real. I mark who asks for what. You'd be surprised what guilt'll make a man save." Dean stared. "You still got your survey kit?" Silas nodded slowly. "Then I need you to come with me to the courthouse. I'm filing a claim, on behalf of John M. Jensen's estate. If Crail forged land deeds, it's time someone blew the lid off." Silas looked toward the sun, squinting. "You're going to stir up more than dust, Dean." Dean turned to his horse. "Good. This town's had too much settled dirt and too little truth." By sundown, Dean and Silas were in Arroyo Bluff's filing office. The clerk stammered but didn't stop them. Dean placed the deed, a notarized witness statement, and Silas's map on the counter. It wasn't just a legal move. It was the first strike. That night, back at the ranch, Dean handed Micah a fresh shirt and a small hammer. "Tomorrow," he said, "we ride to make your father's name mean something again." Micah took the shirt, and for the first time, he smiled. Just a little, but it was enough. The church bells rang clear across Arroyo Bluff that Sunday, drawing folks from as far as the outlying hills. It wasn't just worship that brought them in, it was the annual church picnic. Tables were spread with pies, cold chicken, and jugs of lemonade. Kids chased each other under oak trees, and old-timers leaned against wagons swapping stories. Dean and Micah arrived just after noon. Micah wore a clean shirt, tucked in neat, and boots a size too big. He stayed close, but he wasn't hiding behind Dean anymore. His eyes scanned the crowd with quiet calculation, not fear. Dean kept his hand near the inside pocket of his duster, where the deed to Crow Ridge rested. Silas wasn't far behind, holding a rolled survey map and trying not to swat every fly that dared land on him. As the picnic rolled on, Everett Crail stepped up onto a wagon bed near the preacher's tent. He raised a glass of lemonade and smiled like a man who'd never broken a rule in his life. "Folks," Crail began, "we gather today to honor community and our duty to those left behind. This town's growing. New cattle, new railroads, and yes, new land opportunities. But with growth comes responsibility." Dean narrowed his eyes. "That's why I'm working with Judge Holleran and the sheriff's office," Crail continued, "to make sure every orphan, every claim, and every empty patch of land gets put to proper use. No more squatters, no more confusion, just order." The crowd nodded, slow and uncertain. No one clapped. Dean stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the murmur. "Mind if I ask how many of those empty patches came from blank deeds bought out of saddlebags for $10 and a promise?" Crail's smile tightened. "Dean Fletcher, didn't expect a man of your, past to take the pulpit today." "I ain't preaching," Dean said. "Just asking. Like why you were seen at Dry Needle Ridge with a folder full of unsigned claims." Crail held up both hands. "I work fast. My paperwork's clean. Always has been." Dean turned to the crowd, pulled the folded deed from his pocket, and held it high. "John M. Jensen filed a claim on Crow Ridge before any of y'all ever saw a fence out there. I found the original, buried in the wagon where he died." A hush fell. Silas stepped forward, unrolling his survey map. "And I backed it. Mapped it myself back in '76, before Crail bought up everything west of the river." Crail chuckled. "So now we're trusting faded papers and a half-drunk prospector?" Before Dean could answer, a voice rang out from near. "The lemonade stand." "I remember that boy." Everyone turned. A tall woman in a sage green dress stepped forward, eyes steady. "Micah. I ran the summer reading camp 2 years back. He was shy but talked fine, till he got sent to Mr. Crail's place." Micah stood behind Dean, clutching the edge of his coat. "Miss Albright," Dean said quietly. She nodded. "He came back changed, wouldn't speak, had bruises, but no one listened." Crail scoffed. "Now we're trying to stir emotion with old gossip?" Dean turned to the crowd. "This ain't gossip. It's a boy's life, a man's land, and your conscience." The silence was different this time. Heavy. Thinking. Miss Albright stepped to Micah and knelt. "Micah, honey, it's okay now." He looked at her, then at Dean, then at the crowd. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. Crail's face flushed, but he forced a grin. "Unless you got a court order, this is just noise." Dean folded the deed and slipped it back in his coat. "Then I'll bring noise to the courthouse. Let's see if your papers hold up in daylight." He turned to walk away with Micah beside him. Silas and Miss Albright followed. And behind them, for the first time, half the town didn't look at Crail. They looked at Dean, and started wondering who the real guardian of Arroyo Bluff might be. The morning after the church picnic broke clean and dry. Dust curled off the ridgeline like smoke from a prayer. Dean stood outside the Arroyo Bluff land office with Silas and Miss Albright by his side, the deed folded neatly in his hand and Micah waiting at the general store across the way with a biscuit in both hands. Inside the clerk's office, the air was stale, and the clerk, a skinny man with spectacles too large for his face, looked nervous before Dean even spoke. "I'm filing a protection claim," Dean said, "on behalf of John M. Jensen's estate." The clerk blinked. "Didn't realize there was an active estate." "There is now." Dean laid the deed, Silas's notarized survey, and Miss Albright's signed statement on the counter. The clerk picked through the papers like they might bite. "You're sure about this, Mr. Fletcher?" Dean gave a slow nod. "As sure as I've ever been about anything." With reluctant fingers, the clerk dipped his pen and signed. Dean watched as the seal pressed down with a satisfying thump. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a foundation, something real. That afternoon, Dean and Micah rode out to Crow Ridge. The wind smelled of pine and old ash. Dean carried fence posts strapped to the mule, while Micah toted the post-hole digger like it was a badge of honor. They worked until sunset, setting 3-corner markers and hammering a rough-hewn sign into the ground. Property of J.M. Jensen Estate. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Dean stood back and eyed the sign, then looked to Micah. The boy stared at it for a long moment. "You think your pa would be all right with this?" Dean asked. Micah looked up, and for the first time he didn't just nod, he smiled. They camped near the creek that night, Micah curled in a bedroll beside the fire while Dean kept watch. But peace don't last long in a town where truth threatens power. Sometime before dawn, the horses spooked. Dean grabbed his rifle and stumbled from the tent, just in time to see fire blooming from the barn across the hill. "No," he whispered. "Not again." He and Micah rode hard back to Dean's place. Flames danced against the pre-dawn sky. The barn was gone before they reached the gate. Charred beams hissed in the dust. The cattle pen was empty. Every steer Dean had left was gone, stolen or scattered. Micah stared at the ruin. Dean stepped toward the smoking rubble and kicked at something near the fence post. A glove. Not just any glove. Fine leather, stitched with the initials E.C. Dean crouched, picked it up, and held it in the firelight. The embers reflected in his eyes, and something colder than anger settled in his bones. "This is what men like Crail do," Dean muttered. "They don't fight you in daylight. They rot you out at night." He stood, his voice low but steady. Well, he just made a mistake. By noon, Dean had replaced the fencing with the help of 2 neighbors who'd heard about the fire. One brought nails, the other rope. Neither asked questions. Both left behind more than they came with. That evening, as the sky burned orange, Dean and Micah sat on the porch steps, a pot of beans between them. Dean watched the ridgeline where Crail's ranch lay, untouched, gleaming like a vulture's grin. "Micah," Dean said quietly, "you got a right to that land, but rights don't mean much if you're the only one willing to fight for 'em." Micah didn't answer, but he reached into his coat and handed Dean a folded paper. It was Crail's ranch inventory sheet, from weeks ago. Somehow, Micah had swiped it from the saddlebag Dean found earlier. At the bottom was a list of cattle purchases, and a notation matching Jensen's old brand. Dean's lips tightened. "We're getting close now, boy," he said. "But next time, we bring the truth into the open. No more shadows." And that night, Dean oiled his old badge, just in case. The morning started calm, too calm for a town like Arroyo Bluff. Dean had just finished washing the soot off his hands when 3 riders crested the ridge, Sheriff Halvers, 2 deputies, and Everett Crail himself riding smug between them. Dean didn't move from the porch. He watched them come like he'd watched wild storms roll in, unimpressed, but ready. "Dean Fletcher," Halvers called, "you're under arrest for trespassing, theft of livestock, and harboring a minor without consent." Micah stood just behind the screen door, small fingers curled into the wood. Dean didn't flinch. "Trespassing on land filed under a legal deed, livestock I branded, and the boy Crail calls a ward but don't hold no papers for?" Halvers dismounted. "Don't matter what you believe. You'll get your say in court." Dean nodded slowly. "Then I'll need someone to feed the boy." Crail leaned in from his saddle. "Don't worry. He'll be looked after." The look on Micah's face said everything. That same flinch, like back in the creek bed. Dean's jaw set tight. "Don't go with him," Dean told Micah, calm but firm. "Whatever happens." A deputy stepped forward and cuffed Dean's wrists. He didn't resist. They took him down Main Street slow, like they wanted a show. But Dean didn't hang his head. He met every stare, tipped his chin to the preacher, and nodded once to Miss Albright, who stood frozen on the school steps. They locked Dean in the same cell he once threw drunks in years ago. Dust in the corners, rust on the bars. He sat on the cot, fingers tracing the scar near his knuckle. That scar had stories. So did this town. Near sundown, the outer door creaked, and a man shuffled in, older, stooped, skin like parchment. "Dean Fletcher," he said, voice scratchy. "Name's Elias Carter. Used to clerk for the county registrar." Dean stood. "What brings you down here, Elias?" The man rubbed the back of his neck. "Heard what's happening. I used to notarize deeds for Crail. Didn't ask too many questions back then. Thought he was just fast-moving. But I got a bad feeling about one of the deals. The Jensen land. I kept a copy, just in case." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You have it with you?" Elias shook his head. "Hidden, but I'll testify. If I'm protected. Crail don't forget favors, and he don't forgive." Dean studied him a moment, then nodded. "I'll make sure you're safe. You speak up, and this whole mess starts to unravel." The door creaked again. It was Miss Albright. "I brought dinner," she said, holding a wrapped plate of stew and cornbread. She glanced at Elias and gave a small nod. "And news." Dean took the plate and listened. "Marshal Briggs is scheduled to pass through Tuesday," she said. "Routine circuit check, but he knows you, from your days in Dry Rock." Dean blinked. "Briggs?" She smiled faintly. "He still owes you for pulling him out of that flood." Dean exhaled slowly. "Well, I'll be." Outside, the sky bruised into twilight, but inside that cell, hope flickered. Miss Albright leaned in closer. "Micah's back at the schoolhouse. I told the sheriff I needed help organizing supplies. He's safe for now." Dean nodded. "Tell him I ain't gone. Just stepped aside to open the road." Elias swallowed hard. "I'll go get the papers." Miss Albright watched him leave, then turned back. "If Briggs shows up and sees the kind of justice this town's pretending to have, it could be our chance." Dean looked through the bars, eyes steady. "Then we better make it count." The sun rose hot and mean the next morning, beating down on Arroyo Bluff like it had a grudge. Folks stirred early, whispering about the marshal's arrival. Word had spread fast. Dean Fletcher was going to stand before the town with more than a pair of handcuffs on his wrists. He had evidence, and he had people who believed him. Marshal Briggs arrived just after 9, riding a dusty gray gelding and flanked by 2 state riders. He looked older than Dean remembered, thinner in the face, but still had that steel in his eyes. When Briggs stepped down outside the courthouse, the townsfolk parted like the Red Sea. Dean was brought in through the front, not the back, not hidden. His boots hit the steps slow, steady, cuffs still tight, but his chin was up, his gaze level. Micah watched from the crowd, Miss Albright's hand resting gently on his shoulder. Inside the open-air courthouse, the benches filled fast. Even Silas and old Elias sat near the front, their hats in their laps and nerves in their eyes. The judge, a leathery man named Dunley, cleared his throat. "We're here to settle disputes regarding property, guardianship, and alleged criminal misconduct involving Dean Fletcher and Everett Crail." Crail stood smug in a new coat, flanked by his lawyer and the sheriff. He didn't even glance Dean's way. Briggs stepped up beside the judge. "This is no ordinary case. We've got conflicting claims, testimony of forgery, and potential abuse of minors under color of guardianship. I'll be observing directly." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Dean stepped forward. The cuffs were finally removed, but his wrists bore the red lines of pressure. He didn't start with anger. He started with truth. "Micah Jensen came into my care after I found him injured and branded like cattle. No paperwork, no proof of guardianship, no kindness offered from the man who now claims ownership over that boy's future." Gasps from the crowd. Crail shifted. Dean laid out the deed. Micah's father's original claim, verified by Silas. He handed over the notarized affidavit from Elias, outlining Crail's pattern of buying blank deeds and registering them late. Elias stood and nodded under oath. Then Miss Albright came forward. Her voice cracked but didn't falter. "Micah used to be a loud, bright child until he vanished into Mr. Crail's ranch. When I saw him again, he didn't speak. He flinched, and he bore scars no child earns through honest work." Briggs turned to Micah. "Son, you want to say anything?" Micah stood slowly, eyes locked on Dean. His small hands trembled, but he held firm. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out the old shirt, the one with the cattle brand scorched into it. He laid it gently on the table. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Dean's voice was low. That boy ain't cattle. He ain't property. He's a child, a son. And it's about time someone said no to the kind of man who thinks he can buy folks like fence posts. Crale's lawyer tried to object, but Briggs raised a hand. That'll do, the marshal said. We've seen enough. Judge Dunley leaned forward. This court finds the Jensen land claim valid, the guardianship forged, and the branding an act of abuse. All charges against Dean Fletcher are dropped. Everett Crale will be remanded into state custody for further investigation. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in quiet, tearful relief. Crale's face turned a shade redder than the Arizona clay beneath his boots as deputies took him into custody. His power had slipped through his fingers like sand. Micah ran to Dean, arms wrapping tight around his waist. Dean didn't cry. He just rested a hand on the boy's back and whispered, "You did good, son." As the courthouse emptied, Marshal Briggs tipped his hat. "World needs more men like you, Fletcher." Dean nodded. "World needs more boys like him." Everett Crale didn't walk out of that courthouse. He was dragged, shoulders tight, lips curled, still clinging to whatever pride he had left. The sun had barely crested the roofline when the state deputies clapped irons on him. His polished boots scuffed the dust as he passed through a town that had finally turned its back on him. Dean stood by the steps, arms folded across his chest. Micah sat beside Miss Albright on the bench, the branded shirt folded carefully on his lap like a relic. There were no cheers, just silence and the heavy breath of justice settling into the bones of Arroyo Bluff. Judge Dunley signed 3 orders before the ink dried on Crale's indictment. First, all land claims under Everett Crale's name were frozen pending a full audit. Second, Elias, the former clerk, was granted immunity and placed under protection. Third, and perhaps most personal, Dean Fletcher was awarded temporary guardianship of Micah Jensen, with a full adoption hearing scheduled within 60 days. The moment Dean read that paper, he didn't say a word. He just walked over to Micah, crouched down, and handed it to him like it was a medal. "You understand what this means, son?" Micah nodded slowly. "It means I get to stay." Dean's throat tightened. "Yeah, it means you get to stay." The preacher arrived later that afternoon, hat in hand, sweat on his brow, and hope in his smile. He offered Dean and Micah shelter in the rectory until the new barn could be rebuilt. "You got more folks pulling for you than you think," he said, glancing toward the hills. "Some of the Crale men left their jobs this morning. Told me they're done riding for a man like that." Dean nodded. "Maybe they ain't too late to start doing right." By sundown, half the town had shown up at Dean's busted ranch. Silas came first, hauling planks of cedar with the help of 2 young farmhands. "Figure we can't leave this place looking like a war zone," he said with a grin. Then came the schoolteacher and her older brother with roof shingles. A widow brought pies. Someone dropped off a new saddle. And before Dean could protest, hammers were swinging, posts were rising, and laughter, actual laughter, echoed off the fence lines. Micah helped where he could, fetching nails, filling water buckets. He still didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. He stood straighter now, looked men in the eye. As stars began to shimmer over the bluff, the preacher gathered folks for a small prayer near the front steps. His words were simple. "Lord, bless the hands that rebuild and the hearts that stayed true." Then he turned to Micah and asked, gently, "Son, is there anything you'd like to say?" For a moment, all you could hear was the soft wind through the mesquite. Micah stepped forward, small boots scuffing dry dirt. He looked at Dean, really looked, and nodded once. His voice cracked but didn't falter. "Pa." The crowd held its breath. Dean blinked slow, chest rising as if it might burst. "I reckon I've been called worse," he said, smiling down at the boy. Laughter broke the silence. Not cruel, not mocking, just relief, like a storm had passed and left something worth saving in its wake. That night, Dean stood out by the edge of the pasture, watching the moonlight stretch across the rebuilt fence. Micah came beside him, locket in hand. "Think this land'll hold?" the boy asked. Dean put a hand on his shoulder. It held your father's name. It held you. It'll hold both of us now. And behind them, the town of Arroyo Bluff slept a little easier, for the first time in a long while. The morning after the barn raising, Arroyo Bluff felt like a different place. The air still carried dust, sure, and the heat still came early, but something quieter shifted in the wind. Folks nodded when they passed Dean Fletcher now. A few even tipped their hats, not out of obligation, but respect. Dean didn't need parades or speeches. He just needed a place to call home. And now, thanks to a boy who once didn't speak a word, he had one. Micah woke before first light, tugged on his boots without a sound, and joined Dean near the tool shed. They worked side by side in the hush of dawn, shaping 2 curled cattle horns out of pine and branding irons. The shape wasn't flashy, just simple lines that twisted into an M, the boy's father's initial. And now, a new start. Dean held the wood steady as Micah hammered the sign into the new ranch gate. "Looks good," he said. Micah glanced up. "Feels good." The boy had changed. Still quiet, still thoughtful, but there was strength now, a quiet steadiness in his eyes. He rode easier too, legs surer in the stirrups. He didn't flinch at strangers anymore, and when he smiled, it was full, not cautious. Dean built more than just fences that week. He installed a windmill just above the bluff line, drilling down to the well Micah's father once claimed. "This water's yours now," he'd said, handing the rope to the boy. "Same as the sky and the sun." On Sunday they visited the old wagon site. Micah laid a stone near where they'd found his father's rifle. Dean carved the letters JMJ into it with a pocket knife, pressing the blade slow and careful. "He'd be proud, you know," Dean said, standing back. Micah ran his fingers over the rough edges. "I think he already is." Back in town, Crail's name was all but scrubbed from the courthouse ledgers. Silas, the old surveyor, was hired on as a special investigator for the territory. Miss Albright expanded her schoolhouse, and the preacher opened a summer camp again, this time with Micah helping the younger ones learn their letters. A few folks asked Dean if he'd ever return to law work, maybe run for sheriff. He always shook his head. "I didn't ride back into justice," he'd say. "Justice just rode into me." The adoption papers came 3 weeks later, tied with red string and sealed with the judge's stamp. Dean handed them to Micah without a speech. The boy read the name out loud, Micah Jensen Fletcher, and grinned like he'd just lassoed a star. "You sure about this?" Dean asked. Micah didn't hesitate. "Ain't never been more sure." That night, after supper, they sat under a sky so clear it hurt to blink. Coyotes yipped far off. Crickets sang in the brush. Dean took a sip of coffee and stared out past the fence line. "Hard to believe," he murmured. "Wasn't that long ago I found you down by that creek." "You didn't just find me," Micah said. "You saw me." Dean looked over, surprised at the weight of that sentence coming from a boy who once went weeks without a word. "I guess we both found something," Dean replied. Micah nodded. "A name, a place, a start." Dean smiled. "That's what a brand's for, son. Not to claim, but to remember." As the fire crackled low and the windmill creaked gently behind them, the two sat close, no longer strangers, no longer wounded souls circling each other in silence, just a boy and his father, a man and his son, a future and a name finally tied together. If you believe no child should be branded like cattle, ride with us, like, subscribe, and leave a comment from Texas to Montana.